Welcome back to the bench. I'm Judge Lisa, and this is case number 3. In my time presiding, I have seen greed, rage, and desperation. But I never thought I would see a crime committed, planned, and covered up entirely for the sake of digital validation. This is the case that proved to me that for some, the black mirror of social media is more real than the faces in their own family. The defendant was Caspian Vance, age 24, a name you might recognize. He was known across every platform as the King's Heir, a luxury influencer who specialized in showcasing his extravagant lifestyle. The victim was his father, Elias Vance, a quiet, traditional industrial magnate, and his mother, Sylvia Vance. The charges: double homicide, the murder of both parents, committed with ruthless premeditation, disguised as a tragic accident. The motive was the $150 million Vance family fortune, but the real currency was fame. The core of this case was the toxic tension between old wealth and new fame. Elias Vance was a man of steel and concrete, a man who saw his son Caspian as a frivolous embarrassment. Caspian, in turn, saw his father as the only barrier between him and global digital dominance. Caspian was utterly dependent on his father's immense wealth to finance his image. His parents were old money, private, and deeply ashamed of his son's digital exhibitionism. The relationship was a constant war. We saw email chains spanning 5 years, starting with gentle disapproval and escalating into threats. One chain, submitted by the prosecution, included a chilling message from Elias Vance that read, "Stop broadcasting our life, Caspian, or there will be no life left to broadcast." This was the atmosphere of the Vance home, a pressure cooker of resentment and financial dependence. The key to the entire case, the single document that fueled the homicide, was the Vance family trust. Elias Vance had included a highly specific, almost cruel, punitive clause in the will. Caspian would only gain full control of the $150 million trust upon his parents' death if, and only if, he had demonstrably established a viable, independent enterprise. The trust defined this enterprise using metrics of the modern world. Specifically, Caspian needed to achieve 5 million verified followers across all major social platforms by his 25th birthday, which was just 90 days away at the time of the incident. It was a bizarre, humiliating benchmark set by his father to force his son into real work, believing Caspian would certainly fail.
Caspian's content was failing. His highly produced, repetitive videos showing sports cars and designer goods had stalled. His follower growth had plateaued dangerously at 4.2 million. He was 800,000 short with 3 months left. If he failed, the massive fortune would revert to the Vance Family Foundation, an organization dedicated to metallurgy research, the one thing Caspian absolutely despised. He would be cut off with a humiliating $50,000 annual stipend. He was trapped. He needed a miracle. And that miracle, in his twisted mind, was tragedy broadcast for views. The prosecution meticulously presented the scene of the tragedy: a remote, century-old cabin in the high mountains, used by the Vance family for private retreats. The official initial report by local police concluded the parents died in a tragic gas explosion due to a faulty propane line connected to the kitchen stove. Caspian was the sole survivor, claiming he was out hiking a difficult ridge trail when the blast occurred. He called 911 from the trail. The initial conclusion of accidental death stood for 6 weeks until the insurance company, reluctant to pay out $150 million, called in the state fire marshal's elite forensic team. The prosecution's theory was audacious. Caspian caused the explosion by tampering with the propane line, weakening the connection over several weeks, and then using a delayed, high-heat ignition source he'd concealed in the cabin. The evidence was initially circumstantial, but the state introduced their star witness, Dr. Alistair Rourke, a leading expert in digital forensics and metadata analysis. Dr. Rourke's testimony was centered on one critical piece of evidence, the TikTok alibi. Caspian's social media activity on the day of the explosion was not random, it was manic. He posted a stoic, reflective video exactly 15 minutes before the emergency call, claiming he was seeking peace in nature. This video was his meticulously crafted alibi. His narrative was, "I was miles away when the tragic accident happened. I was disconnected and reflecting." Dr. Rourke, under direct examination, demonstrated the digital flaw in the alibi. That 15-minute video, which Caspian claimed was shot live on the sunlit mountain trail, contained geotagging metadata that showed it was recorded not on the trail, but inside the cabin, 4 hours earlier, using the cabin's secure, private Wi-Fi network before he drove the short distance to the trail to stage his grief. He didn't post it immediately. He pre-scheduled the video to go live 15 minutes before his scheduled 911 call. He was so obsessed with the aesthetics of his alibi, the lighting, the background, the somber tone, that he forgot the basic functionality of the Wi-Fi router. He manufactured his own digital timeline, only to be betrayed by a static piece of code and an internet connection. The defense attorney, a savvy veteran named Michael Cole, fought back hard, arguing that metadata is fallible, subject to environmental errors, and that the prosecution lacked a physical murder weapon. Mr. Cole spent 2 days cross-examining the fire marshal, attempting to prove the propane line was simply old and deteriorated. However, the prosecution then introduced the chronometer logs from a rental car agency 200 miles away. Caspian, paranoid while using his own vehicle, had rented a nondescript SUV under a false name 3 days before the explosion. The log proved the vehicle was at a large electronics store known for selling specialist timers and ignition devices. Furthermore, a residue analysis of the rental car's trunk showed traces of industrial-grade accelerant, the same accelerant used to ensure the complete destruction of the evidence in the cabin. The digital alibi had been shattered by physical movement and the cold certainty of chemicals. The case then entered its most disturbing phase, the exploration of the motive. The defense argued the crime was impossible because the financial reward was already imminent. Why risk murder over 800,000 followers when he could simply buy them? This is where the prosecution pulled the rug out from under the jury, detailing the logic of the grief algorithm. The prosecution didn't focus on the $150 million. They focused on the spike in his engagement rate. They showed that in the 72 hours following the explosion, Caspian posted a series of videos not about the investigation, but tearful, beautifully shot, in-memory pieces set to haunting, trending music. This was his content strategy. His followers didn't just sympathize, they shared the videos with unprecedented ferocity. His follower count didn't just climb, it skyrocketed. He crossed the 5 million follower threshold in less than 48 hours after the explosion. His parents' deaths were not a regrettable outcome. They were a calculated, necessary content strategy to guarantee the inheritance clause was met. But the deepest shock was reserved for his final, vile act. The defense called Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned forensic psychologist, to testify to Caspian's genuine distress. Dr. Reed confirmed his tears in the videos were real, his distress palpable. But then, under cross-examination, Dr. Reed admitted that the source of Caspian's profound distress wasn't the death of his parents. It was a single, cryptic text message he sent to his manager right before the 911 call. It didn't go viral enough. He was distraught because the initial news coverage was slow, threatening his viral spike and his chance at the inheritance. His grief wasn't for his parents. It was the terror of his content failing. He had gambled his life and his parents' lives on a viral surge, and for a few hours, he thought he was going to lose the inheritance anyway. The courtroom was utterly silent. The jury finally understood he murdered his parents not for the money itself, but for the fame validation that the money required him to achieve.
The jury returned the verdict after less than 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. The cold, digital precision of the crime proved intent beyond any reasonable doubt. The court had to acknowledge the unprecedented nature of the motive. The sentencing was a necessary reckoning. Caspian's defense pleaded desperately for leniency, citing his severe social media addiction, his narcissistic personality disorder, and the immense pressure of his father's impossible will. But I had to remind the court that a will, however cruel, does not grant a license to kill. I looked directly at Caspian, whose primary concern even then was his image, and delivered the sentence. I sentenced Caspian Vance to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But then came the final, crucial measure regarding the fortune he had destroyed his life for. I utilized a rarely invoked clause in the state's inheritance code, the Slayer Rule, ruling that because the crime was directly related to the conditions of the trust, Caspian Vance was legally barred from inheriting the fortune. The $150 million was immediately transferred to the Vance Family Foundation, exactly where his father had originally intended it to go if Caspian failed to meet the conditions. The ultimate punishment wasn't just the prison sentence. It was the fact that the platform he created, the 5 million followers he murdered his parents to achieve, would forever watch him lose the very prize he craved. As the officers led him away, Caspian Vance turned to his attorney, tears finally flowing, and asked the final, devastating question, "Will I still get to keep my blue check mark?" That question, whispered in the silence of my courtroom, is the moral tragedy of our age. This case was a stark, chilling lesson in the true cost of chasing the approval of strangers, and the terrifying, deadly consequence when the pursuit of likes replaces the value of a life. And that is the justice rendered in case number 3.